what exactly is nuclear advantage? And what this really is all about is the question of how you can employ nuclear weapons in a way that gives you an advantage. And my argument is that a great power pursuing nuclear advantage can achieve it in 4 different ways, at least theoretically. And let me tell you what those 4 different ways are. The ideal outcome is to be the only state in the system that has nuclear weapons. Then there's no possibility of retaliation. You're the only state that has nuclear weapons. And you can easily begin to contemplate situations where you would use nuclear weapons because you have a great advantage. You are the only power with nuclear weapons. However desirable this situation is, no state is going to achieve nuclear monopoly in our lifetime. The best outcome a great power can hope for in the contemporary world is to acquire the capability to launch a splendid first strike against each of its nuclear-armed adversaries, or at least some of them. As I said before, it's especially difficult for a great power to achieve a splendid first strike capability against another great power, because those great powers almost always have such a large number of nuclear forces. They almost always have, or usually have, an assured destruction capability. But when you're talking about minor powers, it's a different matter. It's much easier for a great power with lots of nuclear capability, especially lots of counterforce, to establish the capability to launch a disarming first strike against a minor power. And you want to have that capability. And that's one of the reasons that the United States will surely seek to make sure it has a splendid first strike capability against minor powers, and it'll try to have that capability against major powers, because that's the best possible outcome, given that nuclear monopoly is not on the table. I would note to you that some prominent scholars, Mark Trachtenberg among them, maintain that the United States had a splendid first strike capability during the Cold War, from the early 1950s up until about 1962. This is really quite interesting. A number of prominent scholars think that the United States, which was arms racing like crazy at the strategic nuclear level during the Cold War, had a splendid first strike capability against the Soviet Union during the early years of the Cold War. And I think there's reason to believe today that under certain circumstances, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, the United States has the capability to launch a disarming first strike against North Korea's nuclear weapons. And I think it's quite clear that in the early 2000s, we had a first strike capability against China. I point out these examples at this point just to give you a sense that these are not unrealizable goals. Not realizable all the time, but they are sometimes realizable. So what I've said to you here is the first 2 favorable outcomes for gaining nuclear advantage or nuclear monopoly, but let's take that off the table, and then splendid first strike. The third best outcome is damage limitation capability. And I'm not talking about escalation dominance here. That's not part of my story, but I'm talking about damage limitation. And damage limitation basically says that you have a very formidable counterforce capability, and you can take out a huge chunk of the other side's retaliatory capability. But there's no doubt that there is going to be some retaliation. And the belief is that the other side is not going to be left with anything approximating an assured destruction capability. You're going to take out so much of the other side's retaliatory capability that only a handful of nuclear weapons are going to get through, right? And if you have that capability and you are desperate enough, so the argument goes, in a crisis, you will use nuclear weapons, or you will at least consider using nuclear weapons because you have a damage limitation capability. And again, just to be very clear for people who haven't spent a lot of time thinking about this, splendid first strike means that you have the ability to take out virtually the entire arsenal on the other side. Damage limitation says you can take out a huge chunk of that arsenal, but you're still going to suffer some retaliation. The least attractive, and this is the fourth strategy, the least attractive first use strategy is manipulation of risk. And basically the argument here is that if you get into a crisis and you think it's essential to use nuclear weapons, let's say you believe your survival is at stake, you launch a handful of nuclear weapons, 2, 3, maybe 4 nuclear weapons, into a remote area remote piece of territory on the other side, or on the ally of the other side. And the basic aim here is to throw both sides out on the slippery slope to oblivion. We all know that nuclear escalation is a subject that is really hard to get your hands around. Actually, if you look at the literature on escalation, forget the nuclear escalation, the literature on escalation in international relations is really quite terrible. Just don't have a good literature. We just don't have a really good handle on escalation. And when you talk about nuclear escalation, we just don't know much at all, because thankfully we've never had a nuclear war. Well, that threat of escalation, married to the fact that you're just using a handful of nuclear weapons, right, the theory goes, will cause the other side, the state that has not used nuclear weapons, that did not initiate nuclear weapons, to change its behavior. You will, in effect, coerce that other state into changing its behavior, because that other state will understand that you're out there on the slippery slope to oblivion, and to put it in Thomas Schelling's terms, the last clear chance to avoid nuclear Armageddon rests with them. And even if they don't understand that at first, and they use 1 or 2 or 3 nuclear weapons of their own, it will quickly become apparent to both sides that you're on the slippery slope. And what will happen is that you will reach some sort of agreement. What you're doing here is you're basically escalating for the purpose of trying to get the other side to de-escalate. That's the basic name of the game here, right? You're not using military weapons for nuclear advantage. When you talk about a splendid first strike, you're talking about taking out the other side's nuclear arsenal. When you talk about damage limitation, you're talking about taking out the other side's arsenal and limiting damage. It has similarities with the whole notion of sort of winning a military war, winning a victory in a military sense. That's not what's going on here. Here you're just manipulating risk. I believe that this is never the strategy of choice for a great power. They don't like manipulation of risk. If a great power is forced to adopt the manipulation of risk strategy, it will nevertheless go to great lengths to see if it can find a way to develop a damage limitation capability, and even better, to develop a first strike capability. You'd much rather have first strike capability than damage limitation capability, than a manipulation of risk strategy. But sometimes you're thrown back to having a manipulation of risk strategy as the strategy of first choice, because you don't have those other 2 strategies. But nevertheless, I believe great powers are never satisfied with manipulation of risk alone.